Welcome back to part 2 of our double episode on Indigenous resistance in the Americas since 1992. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, then I recommend you go back and listen to that first.
Alla mattina, appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 alla mattina.
Before we get started, just a reminder that our podcast is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Our supporters fund our work and in return get exclusive early access to podcast episodes without ads, bonus episodes, free and discounted merch, and other content. Join us or find out more at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. At the end of part 1, we left off in the early 2010s. As in the previous decade, a key site of Indigenous struggles has been over environmentally destructive energy projects on native lands. Especially in Latin America, these have often turned deadly, as settler corporations and governments, both left and right-wing, have used extrajudicial violence and terror against land defenders. Berta Cáceres of Honduras was one of the most prominent organizers for environmental rights in Central America and a co-founder of the National Council of Popular and Indigenous Organizations of Honduras. She was involved in countless land and water protests across the country, including a movement to stop construction of a hydroelectric dam on the Gualcarque River. During that conflict, she was subject to harassment and death threats that she found more credible than past threats of violence. She believed they were coming from the dam construction company, which had also tried and failed to get her arrested on made-up criminal charges. She was assassinated shortly thereafter on March 3, 2016, less than a year after winning the Goldman Environmental Prize, one of the most prestigious awards for environmentalism. In her acceptance speech, she had said, quote, "We must answer their call. Our Mother Earth, militarized, fenced in, poisoned, a place where basic rights are systemically violated, demands that we take action. Let us build societies that are able to coexist in a dignified way, in a way that protects life. Let us come together and remain hopeful as we defend and care for the blood of this earth and of its spirits." In Venezuela, the government of Hugo Chavez announced that the government, along with foreign corporations, would escalate coal mining on indigenous lands. Sabino Romero Izarra was an activist working to protect the rights of the Yucpa community and other indigenous communities in Venezuela. He peacefully campaigned and mobilized against the mining and was subjected to harassment, slander, and arrest for his work. On March 3, 2013, he was shot and killed while driving with his wife, who was also injured in the attack. A few years prior, in 2009, his 109-year-old father, Jose Manuel Romero, was murdered as well. Izarra was one of 13 people who have been murdered in that area in the span of a few years, and none of the murders were solved. In Ecuador, Eduardo Mendua, a Cofán indigenous land defender, was shot 12 times in the garden of his home. His murder is believed to be connected to his work in organizing a struggle against oil drilling. These are just a few examples of the many indigenous activists and land defenders who have given their lives in the struggle against colonialism, which is deeply intertwined with the extraction of fossil fuels, which are the primary source of dangerous planetary heating. In the decade from 2012 to 2022, nearly 2,000 land defenders were killed around the world, 90% of them in Latin America. In the U.S., resistance to fossil fuel projects on native land were going on as well. One prominent example was the 2016 Standing Rock protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline.
In 2016, there was a major mobilization in North Dakota against the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was going to be taking crude oil from the Bakken oil fields and transporting it down to, I believe, refineries down in the southern United States.
This is Gord Hill, author of 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance, who we spoke to in part 1.
The indigenous peoples in North Dakota on the Standing Rock Reservation kind of organized in opposition to this, and it became a massive movement. You had thousands and thousands and thousands of people make their way to Standing Rock to oppose this pipeline construction. And then you had North Dakota deploying hundreds of police and sheriffs and private security forces to counter these protests, which got somewhat militant at times. You know, there was blockades established, and they were met with pretty heavy repression by the police, who shot a lot of less lethal munitions. A lot of people were injured during these protests. And it kind of became a cause célèbre among people in the United States. So you had celebrities, endorsing these protests. I think millions of dollars were raised to support them. Massive encampment was established. And eventually, however, the movement was defeated and the pipeline was constructed. Now, one of the main points of the opposition was, so the pipeline was being constructed to go underneath a river, which is a vital source of drinking water for not only the Standing Rock Reservation, but a lot of communities in North Dakota. So there was also a significant opposition among non-Indigenous peoples who didn't want to see this happen. But the movement was eventually defeated.
While this movement was unsuccessful, others have worked, and there are important lessons to be learned from both experiences.
I like to compare this to the struggle in Elsipogtog in New Brunswick, which was carried out by the Mi'kmaq against exploratory drilling for fracking. There was this company came in 2013, and they wanted to search for shale gas deposits located in shale rock, and the way that they would be extracted was through fracking, which involves the use of hundreds of toxic chemicals to kind of flush this gas out of the shale rock formations. The Mi'kmaq began their campaign in the summer of 2013. They, as this exploratory drilling company came in, and they used kind of small seismic charges to kind of map the ground. The Mi'kmaq initially began carrying out kind of like civil disobedience. They were blockading roads, then getting arrested. And meanwhile, the exploratory work was just being carried out, kind of with a minor disruption. And then the Mi'kmaq Warrior Society came in, and they established more militant blockades. This led to a very large police mobilization to dismantle these blockades. It resulted in confrontations with the Mi'kmaq, the use of lethal munitions, the deployment of a very large police force, riot police, emergency response teams, and armored vehicles. And in one confrontation, the police were forced to retreat, and they actually abandoned 6 of their vehicles, which were then set on fire. So this was a very big operation by the police. Over $5 million, I think, were spent. The company that was carrying out this exploratory work eventually withdrew. So this was a big victory for Elsipogtog, protecting their water, their land. And it had a significant impact on elections, provincial elections the next year, which were seen as kind of a moratorium on fracking. So the party that was opposed to fracking won the election, and there was a moratorium established that there would be no fracking carried out in the province. So that was a major victory. And I compare this to Standing Rock. Now, Standing Rock, their campaign was like super focused on nonviolent civil disobedience. I mean, there were militant factions there, militant Indigenous peoples that were there, but overall the campaign was very, very nonviolent civil disobedience type of thing. Had massive public support, but was defeated. And comparing that to Elsipogtog remained a very grassroots community effort that used a diversity of tactics, including militant blockades and militant direct actions. There was a lot of sabotage carried out of these seismic devices as well. So I compare the two of them because Elsipogtog was actually victorious. They defeated this exploratory work that was being carried out, and they stopped the fracking from occurring in their territory. So I use those two. I think they're really good examples of what's successful, how communities can organize themselves and defeat these types of projects.
Across a lot of these movements is a broader cultural trend that's become known as the land back movement.
I think the term land back originated on the Six Nations territory. The Six Nations is the largest reserve in Canada. It's located in southern Ontario. And I think there's like, I don't know, 13 or 15,000 people. They're all from the Haudenosaunee, which is known as the Iroquois Confederacy. So this was a reserve that was established in the aftermath of the American Revolution and I think the War of 1812, where the British allies, Indigenous allies, were brought into Canada and given parts of different reserve lands. So this Six Nations, that's where this reserve comes from. In 2006, they had a major resistance action occurring, which was aimed at stopping this housing development, a suburban housing sprawl development that was being constructed on their territory, which this reserve land has been chipped away at for years, over 100 years. The government kept expropriating land and making the reserve smaller and smaller and smaller. 2005 or 2006, they set up a blockade to stop construction that was going on of this new housing development. The Ontario Provincial Police went in. They tried to do just kind of come in heavy, pepper spray people, shoot less lethal munitions, and they thought they'd scare the blockade away. That would be the end of it. But instead, they drew in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people from the Six Nations, and this created a months-long, actually years-long conflict. It became a major policing operation. I think they actually built a police station near Six Nations because of this. And it also created a massive conflict with local settlers who mobilized. Hundreds of them would come out demanding that the Six Nations blockades be dismantled, the police go in, and all this kind of stuff. So they've had this kind of movement existing since then, and I think that's where the term land back originated. And then land back became a term, it became much more widespread. I've seen some things down in the southern United States, some groups adopted this slogan as well, but it is kind of a slogan now, land back, kind of challenging the colonial occupation of Indigenous lands, and kind of like a reclamation type of a movement.
But as great as it's been to have the movement achieving more attention in the mainstream, Gord says that when these things become catchy slogans, it can be easy to lose track of the historical context of the history behind the slogan. He notes that one popular movement centered around the idea of land back was the American Indian movement in the 1970s, which notably occupied Alcatraz for more than a year, among others. These actions continue to be a source of inspiration for Indigenous activists and resistance movements today.
It's like a fashion thing now, T-shirts and clothing printed with land back. And like I mentioned, there's something odd going down in the southern United States with the whole land back thing. I'm just not on top of it, but people have told me about it. The campaign of land reclamation really began in the early 1970s, and especially after the Alcatraz Island occupation, which lasted like a year and a half, and which saw thousands of Indigenous youth go through and participate in this occupation in Alcatraz in San Francisco Bay, and then returning to their communities and then carrying out land reclamations in their communities. So there was a massive movement through the early to mid to late 70s of land reclamations occurring, some of which still exist today, some of which became somewhat institutionalized, and they became schools or other types of kind of permanent activities or buildings and whatnot. So there was the initial wave occurred in the 1970s. And then over the decades, we've had subsequent, there's kind of always been ongoing land reclamations over the last few decades. Shudicath is an example, just north of Whistler, the ski resort. It's in the Statlium territory, and they established a village there in around 2000 to stop a ski resort, which they successfully defeated, but have maintained a camp there ever since. Another really successful one from the 1970s is Ganyange, which is a Mohawk territory in New York State, which was started by Mohawks from Ganawagi, located in present-day Quebec, went down to the United States to actually carry out a land reclamation. And and they did so using armed resistance. And eventually, after a few years of negotiation, they established the territory that they're in now, the Ganyange territory, and they still exist to this day as a sovereign territory. They don't allow police into their territory. They've had small armed confrontations with state police over the years about them trying to enter the territory. So we've had this history of land reclamation that begins, in the early 1970s. And today, you still have some, like the Unistoten is kind of like a land reclamation as well, because they've gone out onto their territory and established permanent structures. The Gidimt'en as well, part of the Wet'suwet'en, they're out on their land. And so you kind of have a continuation of this movement that began in the early 70s. Of peoples at different times, different communities going out and reclaiming parts of their territory. And often it's done to protect the territory against some kind of resource exploitation that's being proposed. So that's the source of some of these land reclamations today, is to protect their territory. The Ganawagi one, which ended up in the Ganyange territory, was kind of in response to a housing crisis in Ganawagi, and the urge to create a more sovereign community. And so that one was a little different. But yeah, you do still have these movements occurring today of land reclamations. And those are the reasons I think they're occurring.
In addition to struggles over land, Indigenous peoples have also played central roles in numerous working-class struggles and popular uprisings, one example of which was in Ecuador in 2019. The protests started after President Lenin Moreno passed austerity measures that, among other things, eliminated a $1.3 billion gasoline subsidy. The Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities led a protest of thousands, including public transit workers and student groups. The protesters completely shut down the country's transport network and successfully blocked every major road and bridge in the capital city of Quito. The protesters planned a general strike as well, and the government responded with force. The protesters forced the government to relocate their offices outside of the capital, and police within the capital used tear gas and other means of violence to try and disperse protesters. Protesters responded with Molotov cocktails, fireworks, and by seizing the country's main oil pipeline and shutting it down. They also burned down the National Auditor's office. Mass arrests and more violence continued. 8 people were killed during the demonstrations and over 1,000 were injured. There were also more than 1,000 arrested. But when President Moreno finally agreed to talk to the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities, they reached an agreement during a televised negotiation, and the government agreed to bring the subsidies back. As the 2020s began, in Brazil, far-right President Jair Bolsonaro attempted to bring more so-called development into the Amazon rainforest, including logging and a major railway system. In response, there has also been a major resistance movement in the Amazon. Thousands have taken to the streets in multiple protests over the last several years, including the largest ever Indigenous protest in the nation's history. While there is a new government in power, these struggles are still ongoing. Also in 2020, the long shadow of colonialism and the toll it took on Indigenous communities and people became especially clear with the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Native Americans in the U.S. suffered a massively disproportionate death rate, especially in the early days of the pandemic. The virus inflicted a devastating toll on Indigenous peoples, taking the lives of many elders and robbing many communities of vital cultural knowledge and experiences. Facing the highest death rate of any ethnic group, there was a wave of mass Indigenous self-organization against the virus, leaning heavily on grassroots collectivism and community traditions. Tribal leaders in Alaska restricted flights into their communities much earlier than the rest of the country, and many Indigenous communities worked together to create and harvest medicinal plant treatments for COVID symptoms, as well as organizing networks of mutual aid and food distribution. After vaccines were developed, Native communities led the way in rolling out vaccines to the population, and this eventually resulted in Native Americans having the highest levels of vaccination of any group. This helped turn the tide of the disproportionate death rates. As the threat of the virus receded, resistance to other areas of colonialism began to emerge again. In 2023, one area of contention in Canada was around fishing.
The Mi'kmaq in Eastern Canada, they're in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, they've had a long struggle around fisheries. They actually have treaty rights to engage in various fisheries on the East Coast, and they've had to fight with the government to have these rights recognized. There was a big case, Donald Marshall, who was charged with illegal fishing. His case went through the Supreme Court, and he eventually emerged victorious. In 1999 and 2000, there was a campaign, the Mi'kmaq community of Burnt Church, where they were going out and trying to engage in their traditional fisheries, food fishery, and they were met with a pretty heavy response from the RCMP and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, which have enforcement officers, which are, these are armed officers which go out and try to enforce the government regulations and that. So that was a pretty big little conflict that occurred. There was blockades. The Mi'kmaq warriors went out, they set up blockades to stop these enforcement actions by the police and the DFO. There was incidents on the water with DFO boats ramming the Mi'kmaq fishing boats. Also a conflict with the settlers who oppose any kind of Mi'kmaq fisheries. And this has been ongoing for decades. So during that time, there was shots were being fired at the Mi'kmaq fishers. Boats were being set on fire. These conflicts continue to this day. I think just 1 or 2 years ago, there was major almost rioting by settlers opposed to Mi'kmaq fisheries. So this is like an ongoing kind of issue as well, with the Mi'kmaq trying to assert their rights to engage in these fisheries, and they're being opposed by the settler fishers and the state security forces.
In 2020, mobs of settlers attacked Mi'kmaq lobster fisheries in Nova Scotia, throwing rocks, setting vehicles on fire, and destroying thousands of pounds of the catch. The 2020s have also seen multiple discoveries of unmarked Indigenous graves in both the U.S. and Canada. Many of these graves have been found at boarding schools where Indigenous children were taken from their families and forced to assimilate to European culture, often in violent and humiliating ways. At least 53 of these burial sites were found at boarding schools in the U.S. alone.
The former residential school where these unmarked graves were found was at the Kamloops Residential School, and they found 215 unmarked graves at this residential school, which operated from 1890 to 1969. And Kamloops is a small city in the interior of British Columbia, located in Secwepemc territory. And after this, other Indigenous communities began looking at their former residential schools, because they're all closed down now, all these residential schools. And so other communities began looking at their former residential schools and bringing in ground penetrating radar. And so eventually, over time, there are thousands of these unmarked graves have been found at former residential school sites across the country. This created a big kind of movement around looking at the legacy and the history of residential schools, the impact they've had on Indigenous peoples. It kind of tied into this whole reconciliation kind of movement that was launched by the government to kind of pacify Indigenous peoples and their movements around these things. I'm tied in with the missing and murdered Indigenous women and these residential schools. So we had this big reconciliation movement arise coming from the top down, from the government. It's just kind of like a hollow public relations kind of effort on the part of the government to kind of deal with these aspects of colonialism and the legacy of Canada. With the residential schools, this began before the discovery of these unmarked graves. There was this big reconciliation thing around residential schools, and they offered fairly significant payouts to the survivors of residential schools who had to submit, their documentation, their history of abuse, of being in these residential schools, which were run by the government of Canada, but they partnered with the churches to administer these residential schools for like 100 years, and tens of thousands of Indigenous children went to these schools where the purpose was to assimilate them into Canadian, European society. But of course, they suffered extensive abuse at the hands of the priests the nuns and the other school staff, because there was no accountability. There was nobody monitoring the situation in the schools. So not only did a lot of children experience physical and mental sexual abuse, which impacted Indigenous communities in a huge way, which made our communities fairly dysfunctional. So we have, and a lot of the alcoholism and drug addiction, suicides, sexual abuse can all be traced back to the legacy of residential schools. But another aspect of the residential schools was the very poor living conditions, very poor sanitary conditions, poor hygiene. Tens of thousands of Indigenous children died in these schools as the result of catching diseases, diseases such as tuberculosis. And in fact, in the early 1920s, there was a doctor who was attending these residential schools as a doctor who wrote a report saying all these children are dying because of the unsanitary conditions in the schools, and he was just his reports were just kind of dismissed. And now, of course, now we know that it was true, and that's where these unmarked graves come from, is all these children who are dying predominantly of disease. I mean, some of them died as a result of abuse and just straight murder. Some of these babies, their unmarked graves are the result of the priests and the school staff sexually abusing young girls in the schools who became pregnant, then had babies, and these babies were just disposed of in these unmarked graves. So there's different sources of the victims that are in these unmarked graves, but the majority of them, I would say, are coming from the disease and the unsanitary conditions of the schools. And that's why there's all these unmarked graves at the schools. After the discovery of these unmarked graves of children at the residential schools, there was kind of like an epidemic of churches being set on fire across the country. I forget how many, maybe 18 or 20 of them set on fire and burned to the ground. And of course, there's widespread speculation that this is in response to the discovery of these unmarked graves.
The boarding schools and their program of forced assimilation also played a huge role in the near death of countless Indigenous languages, though many tribes have been trying to bring them back and have started teaching them in schools.
I would say since the 1970s, beginning in the 1970s, which corresponded with the emergence of Indigenous social movements, resistance movements, liberation movements. There was a revitalization of culture overall, generally speaking, traditional painting, carving, crafts, and that's when the language revitalization programs, I think, really began. And they've progressed over the years. So now a lot of schools that are managed by the band councils actually teach the languages in the schools. So here in my community of Alert Bay, I'm living on the Numgeese Reservation, and the band school, the Tlisali-Galakwa School, teaches the language. And there's now a couple of generations of people who were taught the language as children and are now teaching it. And some communities are more successful at this. I think I'd say over like nations like the Cree and the Anishinaabe, which are very large, have had I think more success in retaining a lot of the language. I think the Mohawk have done a lot as well, because they had survival schools that they established in the 1970s in which language immersion courses were developed as well. So that's another aspect of it, is these immersion courses where the children are taken to a camp for a week or so, and it's only the traditional language is being spoken as a part of trying to teach the language. So yeah, it's been a big movement beginning in the 70s. It's fairly widespread now, fairly standard, I would say now. In Central and South America, but that was the Spanish, predominantly the Spanish colonizing those regions. And they set up missions in that to take some children and educate them in the Spanish colonial ways and whatnot. There was no widespread kind of residential school infrastructure established. And a big part of that is the state in these regions was just not as established. Like the state infrastructure was just not as established. So a lot of these indigenous communities, like in the highlands of Guatemala and in the highlands of Chiapas, you had very little actual government infrastructure. There was no residential schools, and these people were almost just left on their own, other than maybe the exploitation for resources like logging or coffee plantations or whatever. These people were mostly just left on their own. So this lack of government infrastructure meant that these peoples actually retained way far more out of their traditional culture than we experience here in North America, where we had the state infrastructure was much more established, much more expansive, much more dominant over the lives of Indigenous peoples. And so that's why the residential school system here was much more successful in eradicating Indigenous culture and assimilating Indigenous peoples into the European society.
The near loss of many Indigenous languages and the efforts to revitalize them are also part of an ongoing effort amongst Native peoples to remind the culture at large that they are still here. So much of the myth-making of colonialism has included perpetuating the idea that Indigenous peoples are some sort of extinct species or relic of the past. It's easier to whitewash our genocidal history this way, and Indigenous resistance movements are one way to reassert their personhood. One place this myth of extinction is perpetuated is in the racist naming of sports teams.
The United States had the revolution against the British, and they forced the British out. And being freed from British colonialism, the newly established United States, of course, began its rapid and genocidal expansion westward. And this really became a big part of American culture, of course, the Indian Wars, right? And this phenomenon of naming sports teams and military vehicles and whatnot after Indigenous peoples is kind of like a form of triumphalism. The triumph of America over the Indians. We conquered the Indians, and as a consequence of that, we're going to take parts of their culture and kind of display it. So then you have, the Cleveland Indians, Washington Redskins, and all that. And so, eventually, I think beginning in the 70s, maybe by the 1980s for sure, you had campaigns against the sports teams, these kind of racist logos and caricatures, and that it kind of became almost like the main cause of movements like the American Indian movement after it was kind of defeated or declined as a result of the severe repression of the 1970s. By the 1980s, you kind of had a fragment of a movement, and that was one of the big campaigns that they kind of focused on, was the sports teams' mascots. And also this applies with the military, like the Apache gunship or the Chinook helicopter, this type of stuff. In Canada, because Canada remained firmly a part of the British Empire and a colony up until, I think, 1867, when we had the Confederation Act, and Canada was kind of established as somewhat of an independent country. But we kind of followed the British strategy of colonization and whatnot. And so in Canada, we don't have adoption of Indigenous tribal names for sports teams. We don't have that kind of a culture here. But what you do see, especially here in British Columbia, is a lot of the expropriation of Indigenous culture, especially artwork, for government logos, tourism. We've had some of the big ferries here that service between Vancouver and Vancouver Island have had these big Indigenous artworks wrapped on the vessels. We have totem poles being commissioned by the government at different sites and stuff like that. But yeah, definitely a different kind of a cultural kind of appropriation that occurred between the United States and Canada.
Though much work has been done in changing racist Indigenous sports mascots, at least one racist team name still exists in all 4 of the major professional sports leagues in the U.S. In addition to mythologizing around the idea that Indigenous peoples were entirely conquered by colonizers, another myth that Indigenous resistance movements aim to confront is that their land was ever ceded to the colonizers at all. Resistance and organizing around these things has led to the popularization of land acknowledgement statements, which, although often well-meaning, have also become a symbol of the hollow ways that a slogan can ease the colonial conscience without any need for real material change or direct action.
Louis Hall was a Mohawk writer and artist. He designed the warrior flag that we're all familiar with now. And in his book, The Warrior's Handbook, he had talked about stop calling your reserve a reserve, start calling it a territory. One of the things of this was in a lot of places, a lot of cities and a lot of towns, because of the apartheid nature of colonialism, a lot of people have no clue that the city that they live in or the town that they live in was actually an Indigenous territory. And then of course, they have no idea whose territory that was. So beginning in, I'd say, the mid-1990s, there was kind of a movement among Indigenous peoples to start acknowledging whose traditional territory different events were occurring on. So in Vancouver, for example, I mean, a lot of us, we kind of vaguely knew it was Coast Salish territory, but we had no idea which communities had actually lived there. So now we know it was, the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish. And so these land acknowledgements kind of began from the grassroots. And it was kind of a way of acknowledging the reality and the history of colonialism, and also acknowledging the peoples whose traditional territory you were on. And then it began to become more normalized. And then you had kind of like more progressive groups started adopting this land acknowledgement. Anytime they opened an event, they would acknowledge whose land they were on. And then they would bring in members of the community whose traditional land that was to do a traditional opening. I mean, this kind of reached its peak with the 2010 Winter Olympics in Vancouver, where they constructed an entity known as the Four Host First Nations, which was comprised of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Musqueam, and the Lillooet, the Statliam. And so this was the peak aspect of that. And in some ways, it's become kind of routine, and you could say it's kind of become co-opted by the government officials will routinely invoke this, and it kind of looks like, oh, they're really acknowledging Indigenous sovereignty, but of course it's not. It's just a public relations thing. But I still think it's a good thing, because otherwise people have no idea whose territory they're on, and it doesn't even, one thing about the land acknowledgement is it brings up the question of, well, whose territory is this? It opens up the discussion of colonization, that there was a people who lived on this land that this city has now been constructed on. And I think it's a good segue into talking about the history of colonialism. So it's not something I oppose, but I clearly see it's been somewhat co-opted by the government and, by other institutions and whatnot.
Indigenous activists have also launched numerous projects researching and propagating information about their ancestral land. One project we are particularly fond of is native-land.ca, a crowdsourced interactive map of Indigenous lands. It's also based on open source software, so we've been able to incorporate it into our People's History Map as an additional layer at map.workingclasshistory.com. Another way that Indigenous peoples have been resisting colonialism on a cultural level is through alternative ways of thinking about gender and sexuality. First officially adopted by the second annual gathering of Native American gays and lesbians in Manitoba, Canada in August of 1990, the term Two-Spirit describes Indigenous people who, quote, embody diverse or non-normative sexualities, genders, gender roles, and/or gender expressions, end quote. The term reflects a pre-colonial view of gender that Indigenous peoples are reclaiming and revitalizing after centuries of violent repression. Before the arrival of colonizers, many First Peoples had as many as 7 or more different genders with distinct roles in their communities. European and especially British colonizers had a rigid, unscientific, and binary approach to gender and sexuality, which they enforced wherever they went. The legacy of this remains today, where most countries where homosexuality is illegal were previously part of the British Empire, and in most cases, homosexuality was originally prohibited by British colonial authorities. Regarding land, it's hard to find clear data, but it appears that in many places, Native Americans are succeeding in turning back the tide of land theft with land-back projects. In addition to direct action, other campaigning and legal avenues, including land purchases, have been utilized. In the U.S. over the past decade, through a plan implemented by the Department of the Interior under pressure from Indigenous activists, nearly 3 million acres of land has been consolidated and returned to tribal trust ownership. Elsewhere, Native nations have won back control of lands which had been stolen. For example, the nearly 20,000-acre National Bison Range, established illegally in the Flathead Reservation by President Theodore Roosevelt, has been returned to the Native peoples who had been dispossessed. The Rappahannock in Virginia, after 20 years of fighting, achieved federal recognition in 2018 and acquired nearly 500 acres of woodland. The Snoqualmie in Washington state, who had been derecognized by the government, successfully regained federal recognition in 1999, and since then have added thousands of acres of land, including the beautiful Snoqualmie Falls, made famous in the theme music to the TV show Twin Peaks, but of special significance to the Snoqualmie, both as a venue for fishing and hunting and as the site of their creation story. Gord Hill says that his decades of involvement in and documentation of Indigenous resistance movements, through both victories and losses, have brought him to the conclusion that especially when it comes to the impending climate crisis, resistance is a matter of survival.
I think resistance movements really help communities organize and come together over a common cause, and it helps establish the networks that we're going to need to survive in the future. As the system begins to decline, as you begin to see the further decline of government infrastructure, which we're seeing right now. I mean, in Canada, a lot of hospitals, they're closing their emergency rooms overnight. Right now, in the northern Vancouver Island here, we have very limited access to emergency services. We have to leave our town and go to another town for emergency medical services. And just all these kinds of things are happening, and communities are going to have to become more and more self-reliant and more self-sufficient. And so I think it's really important that people start to look at this and start to consider how they can kind of prepare for this. So one thing I kind of promote is this idea of resistance and survival. The conditions that we're in around the world today with these crises that we're facing, the climate change crisis, which is having profound impacts on the global society and the global economic system, and which is creating more crises in its wake. But one thing I really promote is the resistance and survival, because resistance movements that are protecting environmental areas, clean drinking water, protecting lands against environmental destruction, I think these movements are really important.
In 2021, the Indigenous Environmental Network and Oil Change International produced a study showing that already Indigenous resistance in the U.S. and Canada has blocked fossil fuel projects which would have contributed emissions equivalent to 12% of all current CO2 equivalent emissions from those countries. That's the same as around 200 coal-fired power stations. Supporting Indigenous sovereignty and resistance is something which is vitally important for all of us, and will only become more so as the devastation of the environment continues.
They're going to maintain these lands and these waters that we're going to require, and that future generations are going to require for their very survival. Because I think a lot of people can see that this is kind of like a one-way system, and it's in a serious process of decline right now. And this climate crisis is, I think, really going to push it over the edge, and we're going to see significant social changes in the coming years. And I think it's something that people should prepare for, because this system, it's not going to last forever. We can see it's declining right now. We can see these crises are becoming, more severe. And so I would just end with those words.
Alla mattina, appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao alla mattina.
That brings us to the end of this double episode. Thanks to Gord Hill for taking the time to talk to us and fill us in on some of the noteworthy events that have happened since the publication of his book, 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance. It is only support from you, our listeners, which allows us to make these podcasts. So if you appreciate our work, please do think about joining us at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. link in the show notes. In return for your support, you get early access to content, as well as ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content, discounted merch, and more. And if you can't spare the cash, absolutely no problem. Please just tell your friends about this podcast and give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app. If you'd like to learn more about the last 32 years of Indigenous resistance, check out the webpage for this episode, where you'll find images, a full list of sources, further reading, and more. You can also get Gord's book, 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance, and you can get 10% off of it and anything else using the discount code WCHPodcast. Links in the show notes. Thanks also to our Patreon supporters for making this podcast possible. Special thanks to Jameson D. Saltzman, Jazz Hands, Fernando Lopez Ojeda, and Jeremy Cusimano. Our theme tune is Bella Ciao. Thanks for permission to use it from Dischi del Sole. You can buy it or stream it on the links in the show notes. This episode was edited by me, Tyler Hill. Anyway, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and thanks for listening.
Partigiano, portami via. Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Partigiano, portami via.